migrations are back. For 50 years, the gospel was in archaeology, no, people didn't really move. They may have moved out of Africa, yes. They had to spread over the globe, but then they started to settle. Agriculture, maybe there was some movement, but after agriculture, then everything was quiet. And people were like in modern welfare societies, you know, they would exchange ideas about this and that, but people would stay put. How wrong we were. People have been moving and migrating en masse after the Neolithic, and they have kept doing it until the present day. It's a human condition. So I'm talking about three big transformations in European prehistory. The farming transformation, the pastoral transformation, and the Middle Age transformation. I'm not actually sure if I will get to the Middle Age, because that will maybe take another hour. So now we have to look into what are, and here we come to the interesting research questions that we can now ask. What are the factors that can lead to transformations, to migrations? Genetically speaking, changes. I'll come back to that. And that leads into disease environment. In a way, diet and disease environment are also closely interlinked. And then, of course, ecological changes. So let's begin with farming. This is a well-known story for many archaeologists, of course, that what we know now is that European farmers, they came from Anatolia. So genetically speaking, all European farmers, whether they take the sea route into the Mediterranean or they take the Balkan route into Central Europe, they are Anatolian farmers who started to move. And they look more or less the same all over, genetically speaking. The interesting thing is that also genetically speaking, there was very little admixture with hunter-gatherers. They clearly felt superior. They were civilized. They brought the new civilization. Hunter-gatherers were barbarians. At least that's what we know from many ethnographic studies. That's how it works.
Presentation with some of the ideas I have developed in the book. Just to mention that many of these ideas are also to be found in David's previous book, Who We Are and How We Got Here. And they are based on kind of a new information that is emerging from the analysis of ancient human genomes. Some of the ideas can be found, as we will see, from modern genetic data, but without the possibility of having ancient genomes from space and time is difficult to know some of the questions that are shown in the modern data. This is a map of modern genetic data. Is built on about 600,000 variable positions in the human genome and several hundreds of modern Europeans. And when this kind of analysis were published already 10 years, more than 10 years ago, most of it is modern data. What was possible to see is that it emerged the kind of the map of Europe in very, let's say, general terms. There are some gaps, of course. It's not a perfect map. Some of the gaps are simply because some populations are not well represented. But the general idea of that is there is enough information in the genomes, even in Europe, which is considered the most, genetically most uniform continent, to mimic geography. So we don't use geography for anything. The populations labels are painted after the analysis. This is just a principal component analysis where we compress all the information, this enormous amount of genetic information we have, and then it emerges the kind of a map of Europe. So I know most of you cannot read probably the labels, but here are the Spanish populations, Portugal, France, Great Britain, Scandinavia, Germany. I mean, there are some gaps, of course, Italy, Greece, the Near East, north of Africa, and then we go to the Middle East, etc., to the Iran and other populations. So, of course, when these kind of maps were first published, the question that comes to the mind is when this structure was generated in the past. But then that's the question. Without the ancient data, the whole idea that was difficult to test. Of course, the first hypothesis that comes in mind to explain this kind of genetic structure is the big transition that took place with the arrival of farming into Europe. As you know, the farming was emerged 10,000 years ago in the Near East, in the Middle East, and then it spread through Europe, following different routes, one in the north shores of the Mediterranean, the other one following the Danube River to the central plains of Europe. And this can be explored archaeologically because, among other things, there are many sites, and the first farmers had things that the previous hunter-gatherers didn't have, like pottery that can be, recognized archaeologically. So, in absence of any kind of genetic data, the suggestion was that this structure we were seeing in modern Europeans was basically attributable to these migrations. But of course, it is difficult to look at the archaeological record without genetic data. I mean, it has been done for hundreds, well, not hundreds, but tens of years, and there are many issues that make it difficult to understand what we are seeing in the archaeological record, not only in terms of migrations, because sometimes people who is migrating, they really look like the people who was previously there, at least at the skeleton level, but also if we want to look at things like social structure. For instance, we have in the Upper Paleolithic, these are reconstructions. We have this man in Sungir, in Russia, which is clearly is a person who had very sophisticated clothing, and it has been estimated that only for the 3,000 mammoth ivory bits it had in the clothes, the group where this man was living really they need to manufacture for hundreds of hours to make these clothes. But of course, we don't know what does it mean in terms of social structure, inequality in the group, or how this finding can be generalized. I mean, is an exception, is a leader, is an important person, is really difficult to generalize. I mean, is an exception, is a leader, is an important person, social structure, inequality in the group, or how this finding can be generalized. I mean, is an exception, is a leader, is an important person, is really difficult to know just looking at the archaeological record. But also, even from an anthropological point of view, the most basic information that could be the sex of the individuals is sometimes unclear. And this below there is this other example of the famous triple burial of Domni Bestonice, where there were supposed to be 3 teenagers buried. One was supposed to, in the middle one was supposed to be a woman, a young woman, and then they are buried in a very strange way. One was buried face down, the other was buried with the hands on the pubic region of what's supposed to be the woman, and it clearly had a very high symbolic meaning. And the hypothesis, at least when I was studying some decades ago in anthropology, was that the woman was a higher status woman that maybe died during pregnancy, and then the shaman was executed, etc. Something, or a love triangle, or something that happened. But very recently, just a genetic study on these individuals, in a study that also was led by David, just shown that the 3 individuals are in fact 3 males. So all the interpretation that took place just from the fossil record, the archaeological record, needs to be rebuilt. I mean, it can be still, can still be a love triangle or something, but clearly we have problems for dealing even with the most basic data, which is in this case the sex of the individuals. And of course, if the structure we have seen in modern genetic data in Europe is something that is related to the turnover of the arrival of the farming, a pertinent question is to ask ourselves how the populations that were previous to the arrival of the farming look like. So how were the hunter-gatherers that lived before the arrival of agriculture in Europe? And I put this, is an artistic representation, and I found in internet. I like it for several reasons, just to show that these hunter-gatherers were not brutish and primitive people, that they could, they could have, a sophisticated culture. Some of the things are of course invented, like the hair and so on, the style, which is just an artistic interpretation, but it's fine. They were reasonably sophisticated. But the other thing that I wanted to show you is that these people didn't look like these ones. So physically, they were different. And this is another thing that we have learned from the retrieval of ancient genomes from these hunter-gatherers that were before the arrival of the farmers. So 8,000 years ago, it turns out that the hunter-gatherers in Europe, they all had, or most of them had, the mutation underlying the blue eyes in modern Europeans. Even the hunter-gatherers that were in Southern Europe, where blue eyes nowadays are rare, let's say, showing this map. Of course, the higher frequency of blue eyes are in Northern Europe. And the genomic composition, let's say, of these people is nowadays gone. So there are no modern Europeans that are 100% genetically like the hunter-gatherers that were 8,000 years ago, but the ancestry is still partially preserved in Northern Europe, around Scandinavia, which it makes sense in general if we think that there the farming is in principle not as a good option climatically as in the rest of Europe. So so now the European populations, they have different ratios of this ancestry, which is gone, and the very last, where the farming is in principle not as a good option, climatically as in the rest of Europe. So so now the European populations, they have different ratios of this ancestry, which is gone, and the very last hunter-gatherer, the very last person with a hunter-gatherer complete genome, I think it has been found in Poland about 6,300 years ago.
Hunter-gatherers also don't want to become farmers. Why should they? And farmers, hello Alex, farmers, but they need each other. So farmers will often trade with hunter-gatherers, and they may have needed them to find their way up in the big forests at some point. But basically speaking, genetically speaking, they kept to themselves. There were very little genetic admixture with hunter-gatherers in the beginning. So gradually, when they reached carrying capacity of started moving out here, then they start to intermix with hunter-gatherers. That's when it happened, from the later fifth millennium onwards. For reasons we still do not know, but probably they needed each other now. But there were other conditions too, I think, played a role. I'll come back to that. Now, the interesting thing here is that I'll come back to that. Now, there were other conditions too, I think, played a role. I'll come back to that.
But by the way, 300 years ago. But by the way, in a farming community. But there are also other differences, and these also can be ascertained from the genetics, and it's something that we will never know just looking at the anthropological remains of these people. And when these the genes that are related to pigmentation that has been checked in these ancient genomes, it turns out that the hunter-gatherers in Europe, they had the ancestral variants in these two crucial genes for light pigmentation in modern Europeans. So clearly they had to have a kind of darker pigmentation than modern Europeans, but with in Europe, they had the ancestral variants in these two crucial genes for light pigmentation in modern Europeans. So clearly they had to have a kind of darker pigmentation than modern Europeans, but with blue eyes. And then we start having genomes from the early farmers that met these people and absorbed these people by mixing with them. These early farmers looked different. Interestingly, they had fair skin and dark eyes, and as I mentioned before, spread through Europe in different routes, let's say, and eventually they replaced the hunter-gatherers. And now the ancestry of these early farmers is mostly present in the, let's say, the north shores of the Mediterranean. And then they decrease as we go further north in the continent. So all this story of migrations, of course, they are interesting by themselves, and I would say that probably me and probably David also, when we start in this kind of studies, we were essentially trying to understand the genetic composition of modern populations, as I have shown in Europe, by trying to understand the different migrations that have been overimposed a long time. But in fact, migrations are not only changes in the ancestry composition, but also are ways prone to create inequality and dominance.
Now, the interesting thing here is that migrations are, of course, linked to a specific economy and a specific way of organizing yourself. The farmers, of course, that came from Anatolia, they were used to a warm climate. They were used to live in clayscapes, in clay houses, forming tell settlements with many hundred people living together. The soil was quite productive, so they could do that. But they reached a kind of limit here. When they came up here to the Carpathians, around here, they couldn't continue because now you enter the temperate zone and it's all forested. You cannot really bring your Anatolian lifestyle into Central Europe. So they had either had to stop or they had to change. They changed. They adopted. They adopted to a timberscape. They started building houses of timber. They split up in smaller groups because they could not. The big settlements could not be sustained any longer. They split up in smaller groups because they could not. The big settlements could not be sustained any longer, and we got something called linear band culture. So again, here we have the importance of the environment and how a social and economic organization has to adapt or stop. And now they start mixing also a little more with hunter-gatherers. And here, the way we show that in genetics is often the PCA diagrams. So we simply show the different genetic components. And it's a very, very pedagogical way of showing it. So up here we have, down here we have Middle Neolithic, Early Neolithic people, Globular Amphora, that's later, a Late Neolithic, and then we get caught at where, I'll come to that, Bronze Age up here, and over here, West European hunter-gatherers, that they will start mixing up with. So you can see this is about genetic distance and admixture between the different peoples and a way to show it. This is very common to show that. And there's, of course, a very big difference from here when we come down here like Anatolia and then up here where we get the steppe component coming in here. There's a very big distance here. And then hunter-gatherers over here. And Eastern European hunter-gatherers up here. Now, to get back to the early farmers, you may think that farming is progress, but that's not necessarily so. It depends on how you define it. Actually, in many ways, if you look at health, farming, or at least the early farming, was not progress. In diet-wise, it was not progress. As I said, don't have modern dental care, you get bad teeth. And bad teeth is bad for your health. So in the long run, this was not good. we can see here that they had these very strict norms for diet. And hunting was a minority, and only the poor households would do some hunting. Good for them. So cattle and pig were dominant animals, so they got some meat. So because they had no lactose tolerance, so they got some meat. They got some milk, but not a lot, because they had no lactose tolerance. So teeth condition really declined. But populations went up and up and up because you could feed a lot more people. So all the first generation farmers were really on their way up. But soon they reached the ceiling. And once all of Central European was colonized, the competition, demographic pressure started. Competition over resources started, over territories. You start to fortify your settlements, you start to fight against each other, you start to kill each other to take your settlements and your fields. And in the end, you may decide to vote with your feet and move out, move away into new territories. And again, you had to adopt, and then they realized that it was perhaps not such a bad idea to intermix and have sex with hunter-gatherers. And again, you had to adopt, and then they realized that it was perhaps not such a bad idea to adopt and move out, move away into new territories. And again, you had to adopt, and then they realized that it was perhaps not such a bad idea to intermix and have sex with hunter-gatherers. After all, hunter-gatherers were quite robust and healthy people. And after all, hunter-gatherers were quite robust and healthy people. The hunter-gatherers here to intermix and have sex with hunter-gatherers. After all, hunter-gatherers were quite robust and healthy people, and they needed that. It was genetically, and they needed that. Robust and healthy people, and they needed that. It was genetically good, actually, because actually what happened over the first 2,000 years of farming is actually that stature declined. They become smaller due to bad health conditions. And here we see the massacres when there are too many people and too little food. We have two types of massacres. I'll come back to that, or killings. There is the kind of killing where you kill everybody. You kill a whole community. The kind of killing where you kill everybody. You kill a whole community. There is the kind of killing where you kill everybody. You kill a whole community. Seem to get rid of them and take their land. The other type of killing is selective, and it's global or universal. You kill males and you abduct, take away the women. And you kill the males because they cannot, so they will not revenge. And you need the women for reproduction, for labor and other things. Away the women. And you kill the males because they cannot, so they will not revenge. And you need the women for reproduction, for labor and other things. These are the two ways we have in European prehistory.
And as we'll see different examples where this happens associated to these ancestry turnovers that we are exploring. So the ancient DNA has had the power to go from understanding these past migrations, and we are still exploring some of them. Let me show, we are still in the Neolithic. Let me show you a study that was published in December, also made by David, associated to these megalithic cultures. The megalithism is it happens in the Neolithic, in this, once the farmers are all over the continent, is characterized by this structure of big stones, like the famous Stonehenge in England. But also in England, there is this barrow called Hazeltown that is it had this aspect, but it has been destroyed some decades ago. But emerged from this study is quite interesting for understanding the societies that could happen in these, at least in these megalithic cultures. What the author found is that there was a kind of a patriarch, let's say, a man who had children. I was going to say who married, but I don't know if is the right word. Had children with 4 different women. And of course, we don't know. It's difficult to know if this was a kind of successive women or a kind of polygamy. And then this community, which is clearly is more than a family, is a clan, I would say, is a structure at least in 5 generations. The people that was buried into this barrow, along with the, let's say, the founder of the community. And there are many interesting things here to see. There is a kind of a structure also in the chambers. The south chamber is mainly for descendants of one of these women, and the north chamber for the other one. But there are interesting things, as I say, that, for instance, a certain lack of women in the clan. When there are women, sometimes they are they died in childhood, and also the women, they are clearly foreign. They came from outside the clan because they don't have parents or they don't have brothers, for instance, in the barrow. So this points out to a kind of a social structure which is known as female exogamy or patrilocality, which essentially means that men remain in the family where they are born, while the females are quite mobile, and they probably are interchange between clans, among clans, to try to make alliances or something. And also an interesting thing, which is difficult to understand also, but is two of these women, they had also children with other men which are not found within the cairn. So this is another example of things that can be done with paleogenetics. If you imagine all these remains sometimes are just single tooth or broken fragments, it would be absolutely impossible to obtain this degree of information about not only the genetic relationships, but also the social structure that could have in these communities. And then there is another evidence for yet another megalith, which is very famous in Ireland, in Newgrange, where this is gigantic structure. And there is a very long chamber where the first light of I don't remember if the summer solstice or the winter solstice go through the chamber, through this tunnel and illuminates the final chamber. And then there is the remains of a man that had also been found in this very important place of the structure and analyzed genetically, and turned out that 25%, about 1/4 of his genome, had no variation at all, which is all the sections can be shown here in the chromosomes of this individual. Of course, we have to remember that we share 50% of our genome. We got 50% of our genome from each of our parents, and we share also 50% with each of our siblings, because it helps every generation we go back. And to have these 25% of chromosomes with no variation, it means that the parents of this individual, they had to be first-degree relatives, maybe let's say siblings, or maybe parent of offspring, or let's say father with a daughter, or maybe siblings. Whenever the combination, what is interesting is that this is pretty unusual in many human societies. I mean, it has been recorded in historical times. For instance, in ancient Egypt, it's known that the pharaoh Akhenaten got married apparently with two of his daughters.
I'll come back to it later. So here we see the development from earliest farming, and we see how first we have things here go up a bit in height, but then it goes down, 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 and then it goes really down. But then, whoop, it goes up again. That's the next migration. And a new economy, that's the step migrations. But before we get to that, we have to understand how they could happen and why they happened. Again, one of those interesting questions we now can start asking. Because what we see is a collapse or decline of the Neolithic prior to the steppe migrations after 3000. So in the late 4th millennium, we see a global decline in Neolithic settlements and activities all over the known world, from Ukraine to Ireland. And we have actually, these farming societies were in some regions, like on the Black Soil in Ukraine, very successful. They built huge mega settlements with 10,000 people living together like these ones here. Tripolia. These farming societies were in some regions, like on the Black Soil in Ukraine, very successful. They built huge mega settlements with 10,000 people living together like these ones here. Tripolia groups here. But suddenly, one after the other, groups here. But suddenly, one after the other, they are left, they are burned. And when we look one after the other, they are left, they are burned. Here. But suddenly, one after the other, they are left, they are burned. And when we look to temperate Europe, we get the same graphs all over the place, from Ireland to the Baltic. We get this dip, universal dip in activities. This is based on tens and tens and 10,000 of C14 days. And it has been convincingly demonstrated that they reflect demography and activities, because pollen diagrams confirm that the forests start to regrowth once activities go down. There is less activity, there are fewer peoples. Why? What's happening? In some areas, like here in Poland, it's dramatic.
Obtain whole DNA sequences from people who lived at the times in question, we now know that the gradient of farmer ancestry is almost exactly perpendicular to what was argued based on the interpretations today. That is, that main gradient of variation is not driven by the farming expansion, but by other things. And the reason for this is that there were very important population replacements and migrations that happened after the spread of farming. I'm going to tell you about that in maybe 20 minutes, what the evidence is for that. So what's actually become clear is that even though it was a very exciting idea that you could reconstruct the past based on patterns of variation in people living today, in fact, it's impossible. And the reason it's impossible is that because people have mixed too much. They've moved too much again and again, and it's overwritten the populations that existed there before. And so the only way to get back to what those movements were like is to actually sample the people who lived at each time. Is to actually sample the people who lived at each time and study how they related to each other. So what happened really beginning in 2010 was a new scientific instrument got invented or became practical. So the technology for ancient DNA has been around for several decades. Variability across our ancestors and how we're related to each other. So the genome is not just a single person. From a statistical point of view, you're not a single person. You contain a multitude of ancestors. So this is very confusing often. But in fact, when you look at your DNA, you think you're a single sample, but in fact, you descend from 2 parents, and your parents descend from 4 grandparents. You descend from 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on, going back in time. And if you go back even 10 generations, you have about 1,000 ancestors. If you go back 20 generations, you have 1 million ancestors. And when your mother and father produce a sperm or an egg, they split the DNA they got from their own parents 1 or 2 times per chromosome per generation. And so the DNA that's coming to you is fragmented across those ancestors. And so when we sequence our genome, we're interrogating thousands, tens of thousands, maybe up to 100,000 ancestors. And so you're not a single person, you contain a multitude of ancestors, and as a result, by sequencing a single person's genome, you can position that person's DNA with exquisite accuracy relative to other genomes that have been sequenced. It's not like flipping a coin once in order to figure out the probability that it's heads. It's like flipping a coin 100,000 times, and then you can get a very accurate sense of the probability that that coin is heads, 50% perhaps. And so that is why there is so much power in a genome, because it's not studying a single person. It's studying and interrogating and sampling a multitude of ancestors. So in my talk, I'm going to tell you about 4 examples of how we were wrong, and in particular, I was wrong in my understanding of the talk. I'm going to tell you about 4 examples of how we were wrong, and in particular, I was wrong in my understanding of the world, and how the genetic data that I had the privilege to look at surprised me and my colleagues very strongly and forced our hand to think in new ways. So the second part of my talk is I'm going to talk about evidence that no one is pure, and I'm going to talk particularly about the part of the world we're in right now, which is Western Eurasia. Europe is part of Western Eurasia. The Near East is another part of Western Eurasia. And I'm going to talk to you about the results of a study published in 2016, which analyzed hundreds of whole DNA sequences from people of West Eurasian ancestry. And ask the question, how does the DNA of those people at that time in the past that we have data from relate to people in this region today? So just to give you a very quick overview of genetic variation in Eurasia today, if you look at frequencies of variable positions in the genome where we differ from each other, there's a vast region of relative homogeneity extending all the way from Iran and Central Asia all the way to the Atlantic facade of Europe, here for example, where people are genetically pretty similar to each other. And then there's a transition zone, and a region of East Asians where you have a similar phenomenon of a broad region where there's over a vast region, people who are genetically pretty similar to each other, although there's important differences. And in South Asia, yet another broad zone of quite a lot of difference, but homogeneity within. And so this pattern has been noticed for centuries, just even based on how people look, which is not a very reliable thing, but has prompted the idea of the word, quote, Caucasian, to refer to this group of West Eurasian ancestry. But what we now know from genetics is that this group just didn't exist 10,000 years ago, and I'll show you the evidence for that. So we got DNA from hundreds of individuals who lived 10,000, 6,000, 3,000 years ago and compared them to people living today. And if you measure at the top level of this picture the average differentiation in terms of the frequencies of genetically variable positions in people living today, what you see is that the level of differentiation is about 0.098 or 0.1 on this scale. What you're measuring is basically you're looking at the frequency of a cytosine or a guanine, a DNA base, in each population, and you're taking the square of that frequency difference between, say, population A and population B, and you're averaging it across hundreds of thousands of independent positions in the genome that you're looking at. And if you look at that measure, which measures how similar populations are to each other, you get that 10,000 years ago across Western Eurasia, the typical level of differentiation was around 0.1, and that's the same as Europeans and East Asians today. So across Western Eurasia today, the level of differentiation is about 0.01, that's the bottom of this plot, and at that time it's different from Europeans and East Asians. By 6,000 years ago, it had dropped by a factor of 3, and by about 4,000 years ago, it had dropped by another factor of 3. And it's not because populations went extinct or disappeared. We now know what happened. So in this paper, we also showed that almost all the DNA, not quite all of it, but almost all the DNA of people in West Eurasia today comes at the time depth of around 10,000 years from 4 highly different sources. Each of them is different from each other as Europeans and East Asians, and each of them we have DNA for. One of them you could think of as Iranian early farmers or agriculturalists who lived about 9,000 or 10,000 years ago. One of them you could think about as Levantine farmers or early agriculturalists, people who lived in Jordan and Israel, for example, at around that time. One of them is Western hunter-gatherers, people who are like Cheddarman or people who lived in this part of Europe about that time. And another is Eastern hunter-gatherers, people who lived in the far east of Europe. And these groups, none of them disappeared. Instead, they mixed with each other, and that's what you see today. And the reason for this homogeneity is a massive mixing since that time, where all these groups contributed to people living today. So lesson 3 in how we were wrong relates to findings about how large-scale migration was common in our past. And I'm again going to talk about Europe because Europe is a place where we happen to have really amazing quality data. Not because Europe is more important than other parts of the world. It's not. It's only a small part of the world. But it's a place where there's good archaeology and where ancient DNA studies happen to be a little ahead of where they are elsewhere in the world. And so we get a flavor for what it can show about the past. So as I mentioned earlier in the talk, agriculture, farming, it invented for the first time in the world in the Near East 12 to 11,000 years ago, shortly afterward, independently probably, in East Asia. But West Eurasian agriculture from the Near East gets to Europe a couple of thousand years later, around 8,500 years ago, jumping probably from Turkey or Anatolia to Greece, and then spreading out. So it reaches within 2,500 years these islands, and also Scandinavia. So there's another cultural phenomenon not documented by archaeology, but documented by the languages people speak. And in fact, people in Europe, with a few very interesting exceptions, speak extremely similar languages. So English is an example of an Indo-European language, which is related closely at some level to the Latin and Romance languages, to Germanic languages, to Greek, and even to languages in India and Iran, which I will talk about later. And so a question is, how does this language homogeneity come to be? people speak. And in fact, people in Europe, with a few very interesting exceptions, speak extremely similar languages. So English is an example of an Indo-European language, which is related closely at some level to the Latin and Romance languages, to Germanic languages, to Greek, and even to languages in India and Iran, which I will talk about later. And so a question is, how does this language homogeneity come to be? In other parts of the world, for example, the small region of the Caucasus in south between the Black and Caspian Seas, there's actually much more language diversity within that region than across the entirety of Europe. In much of South America, there's much more diversity and much deeper diversity than in Europe. So it suggests that some process happened to spread relatively homogeneous languages that over not so long a time diverged from each other and became a little bit mutually unintelligible as they are today. So it was thought over the primary hypothesis prior to 2015 that was dominant was that it was the spread of agriculture and the movements of people that this new economic system would have allowed from the Near East that probably spread these languages into Europe. And we now know that's wrong because we now know there was another large-scale migration, and I'll tell you the evidence for that. So ancient DNA a few years ago had initially been available only for hunter-gatherers and farmers. So people who lived before about 4,500 or 5,000 years ago in Europe had only two types of ancestry. Ancestry like those of the early Anatolian farmers, which actually we didn't yet have data from at that time, but first farmers of Europe, or first hunter-gatherers of Europe. But if you look today, there was a third component of ancestry shown in green in these bar plots showing breakdown of ancestor types in each part of the world, where, for example, in Northern Europe, about half the ancestry was of this green type, which simply didn't exist in Europe 5,000 years ago. So how did it get there? So in 2012, from at that time, but first farmers of Europe or first hunter-gatherers of Europe. But if you look today, there was a third component of ancestry shown in green in these bar plots showing breakdown of ancestor types in each part of the world, where, for example, in Northern Europe, about half the ancestry was of this green type, which simply didn't exist in Europe 5,000 years ago. So how did it get there? So in 2012, we and colleagues, in our laboratory, we developed a new statistical test to see whether a population was mixed. And the way this test worked was that we took hundreds of thousands of positions in our DNA where people vary, and we looked at the frequencies in each population in the world. So for example, in French people, we would measure the frequency in French people of a cytosine at a particular position. It might be 30%. And then we might compare it to Sardinians people in Southern Europe and to Native Americans. And if, on average, the French are intermediate between Native Americans on the one hand and Sardinians on the other hand, that means for sure that the French people are a mixture of two groups related maybe very distantly in the past to Sardinians and Native Americans. So we took data from 50 populations around the world, and we applied this test to each of the 50 populations, and we took all other possible pairs of those 50 populations, and we saw, are they good candidates for mixture for each of them? So when we did this to French, and we looked at all possible pairs of populations, we got a huge and absolutely convincing signal of mixture between Native Americans and Sardinians. And this, we of course didn't interpret this, and it was certainly that was the correct answer. It wasn't Siberians and Sardinians, and it wasn't South Asians and Siberians. It was very much Native Americans. And what we didn't think that what was going on was actually that Native Americans crossed the Atlantic and mixed into Europe. Instead, what we proposed was the following. We proposed that there used to be a population that we called ancient North Eurasians, a population that was once distributed across northern Eurasia and including Siberia. Sometime before 15,000 years ago, it moved east and contributed to the population that peopled the Americas. And sometime later, it also contributed to the people that peopled northern Europe and contributed to French people today more than to Sardinians, explaining our signal. And so this is what we proposed, and that Northern Europeans today are a mixture of Sardinian-like people who we might think of as descended from the first farmers of Europe, and we've now documented that that's probably a good approximation, and an ancient North Eurasian population. And so we predicted this ancient North Eurasian population, what we call a ghost population. It's a population that we predict statistically based on patterns that's left in people today, but that doesn't exist in unmixed form anymore. In the subsequent year, S.A. Willerslev's group, working in Denmark got DNA from a 24,000-year-old boy who lived at Malta in south-central Siberia and found that that individual was closely related to Native Americans and to Europeans, but not to people who live in that region today, showing that they're a representative of that ancient North Eurasian population. They had actually gotten DNA from this population, and that was an even better proxy for this predicted population than the Native Americans. And so we now know that somehow this ancient North Eurasian ancestry entered Europe, and we wanted to find out where. So what we did is we collected DNA across this whole time period. So here is the genetic variation of diverse present-day Eurasian populations. So each dot is about 800 dots. And we do in this analysis is we take a grid of data. So we take about 600,000 positions where we have looked at the DNA. We take about 800 people, so it's a matrix of 600,000 rows and 800 columns, and we multiply the matrix by itself to reveal how close each individual is to each other on average, and then look at the main gradients of variation, much like Cavalli-Sforza did in that first plot I showed you. And what you see is a really remarkable pattern where there's two parallel gradients with relatively little in between. On one side of the plot, on the left, are Europeans. On the right side of the plot are Near Easterners. On the top are people with more ancient North Eurasian ancestry, and on the bottom are people with less. And we now know how this came to be, and I'm going to lay out those dots. So here's these two parallel gradients to show you the ancient people of West Eurasia over time. So here are the hunter-gatherers. The hunter-gatherers fall beyond Europe in the direction of European differentiation from Near East. And what that reflects is the fact that Europeans today are a mixture of these hunter-gatherers who no longer exist in unmixed form and ancient Near Easterners, and that's how they're formed in between these two groups. The next thing that happens is you have a large number of farmers from first farmers of Europe, and they fall genetically on top of where Sardinians fall today. We're consistent with the idea Sardinians are isolated descendants, more or less, of the first farmers of Europe. But you still don't see people like in the main part that the gray dots on the left who are like Europeans today. Meanwhile, far eastern Europe, on the steppes north of the Black and Caspian Sea, this other population develops as a mixture of Eastern European hunter-gatherers and Iranian hunter-gatherers who are at the top end of the Near Eastern gradient. We still don't see people like most Europeans today, and it's only after about 5,000 years ago we for the first time see DNA of that type, and we're reflecting this movement from Eastern Europe of these people who are green squares at the top into Central Europe. And then subsequently, for after that, you see populations like you see today. We now have hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of individuals that are very much like people in Europe. In summary, there is evidence now from geneticsly that two mass migrations. The first after 9,000 years ago into Europe, bringing farmer ancestry shown orange here. There's some mixture with the local hunter-gatherers shown blue. And then after 5,000 years ago, there's a mass movement of people who are from steppe pastoralist backgrounds, and they form north of the Black Caspian Sea. about 5,000 years ago, and they spread through Europe. So the people who spread this 5,000 years ago, and they spread through Europe.
Something dramatic hit these highly, in many ways, well-organized, capable farming communities. Once they went out in temperate Europe, they built these big megaliths. They lived in rather big settlements. They were well organized. Why should they decline? Well, we think we find the answer. The plague is more than 5,000 years old.
In ancient Egypt, it's known that the pharaoh Akhenaten got married apparently with two of his daughters.
Europe, bringing farmer ancestry shown in orange here. There's some mixture with the local hunter-gatherers shown in blue. And then after 5,000 years ago, there's a mass movement of people who are from steppe pastoralist backgrounds, and they formed north of the Black and Caspian Sea about 5,000 years ago, and they spread through Europe. So the people who spread this ancestry and originate this ancestry are an amazing group archaeologically. It's a group called the Yamnaya. So the Yamnaya are the first people who use a new economy in the open steppe lands. The wheel had shortly before been invented and the horse had shortly been domesticated, and they hitched horses to wagons, wheeled wagons, and used them to bring supplies and water out into the open steppe and graze their animals on the open grasslands that were available and much more intensively exploit the steppe.
Lived in rather big settlements. They were well organized. Why should they decline? Well, we think we find the answer. The plague is more than 5,000 years old. We found out a few years ago. Actually, this is a beautiful example of what happens when you work together as an interdisciplinary team. We had one of our work meetings. Mega disease, a big disaster is happening. There must be some kind of mega disease or something going on. Why don't you look for plague? And so they went and looked for plague, and they found it. But no one would probably have done it if it hadn't been sitting together and comparing the evidence and asking questions. So the plague actually has a much longer history. And last year, and so we found out that the Yamnaya people and the Kordovere people, the steppe migrants, they had it. And they had learned to live with it. And they brought it. But this happened several hundred years earlier. So our prediction was that the Neolithic people got the plague and died from it before the migrations. And that's why the migrations could take place. And that's why the migrations could take place. So our prediction was that the Neolithic people got the plague and died from it before the migrations. And that's why the migrations could take place. But we needed proof. And we found it last year in a passage grave in western Sweden. And this is a paper we published in Cell. There we found the mother of all plague, the earliest form, all later plague until the Black Death and until what plague today. They are all derived from that first early plague that we can demonstrate killed Neolithic people in western Sweden, 3000 BC. So in a way, it looks more and more like the colonization of America.
What is interesting is that this is pretty unusual in many human societies. I mean, it has been recorded in historical times. For instance, in ancient Egypt, it's known that the pharaoh Akhenaten got married apparently with two of his daughters. And this kind of happens when the inequality is so high, the hierarchy in the society is so high that you cannot really marry anyone outside the family, because then you will dilute the exceptionality of the bloodline, let's say. And this is the famous, some of the famous reliefs in Amarna, and this the glamorous, let's say, depiction of two of the daughters of Akhenaten And just to remind us about the social structure, very recently in Amarna, they have been excavating necropolis where they found literally hundreds of skeletons buried together without any kind of ceremony, and that represent very young children, teenagers sometimes, but that sometimes just children that apparently have been doing a very heavy work and had many lesions, carrying heavy weights, etc., apparently for the construction of the city of the pharaoh. And also, this kind of endogamy is not exclusive of the old pharaohs. It happened also in the Ptolemaic dynasty. For instance, you can see here Ptolemy IV. He married his own sister, Arsinoe, hence his nickname Ptolemy Philadelphus. But also Cleopatra, for instance, married first one of his brothers, Ptolemy XIII, and then the other one, Ptolemy XIV. And in this case, I would say that it is probably because the Ptolemaics, they were Macedonians, in fact. The dynasty came from the first Ptolemy Soter, who was a general of Alexander the Great, and he was a Macedonian, and then he established himself in Egypt. And although the Ptolemaics adopt many things of the Egyptian culture, like the religion and even the general aesthetics and so on, they clearly were in a very small community, the Macedonian community, and essentially they could not marry, let's say, outside the family with someone of other ancestry, let's say. So far about the kind of endogamy in this period, but then the paleogenetics has shown still another genetic turnover in Europe, which is the arrival of the steppe nomads about 5,000 years ago, the arrival from the steppe. Genetic turnover in Europe, which is the arrival of the steppe nomads about 5,000 years ago, the arrival from the steppes, from the Pontic steppes to the east of Europe, and then the spread of this ancestry across Europe that can be traced in different genetic studies. And these nomads, maybe they had this kind of yurta. This is just a modern picture from Mongolia. They had some kind of a military advantage because they had domesticated horses. They also had baboons, so they were highly mobile, and they could have a military advantage because they had domesticated horses. They also had baboons, so they were highly mobile, and they could transport people and things. They were based on herds of horses and cow and sheep and goats. And there are evidences of violence at the end of the Neolithic when this happened in Europe. The Neolithic communities, they were immersed in their own crisis, but some of these violence could be related to the arrival of these people. And they had other interesting things like individual burials, these kurgans, that are built on top of sometimes a single burial, a single inhumation of a clearly an important person for the community. And again, these represented the effort for several weeks of the whole community to make these gigantic structures in some cases. So we have seen evidences of social hierarchy in the megalithic culture, but this is also a general signal of social structure within these steppe nomads. And for instance, this is another work done from genetics, is a mass grave from kind of the period of contact with these Yamnaya, these steppe nomads, in which the relationships, the family relationships, have been discovered. You can see there are several families here, and one interesting idea is that maybe the people who bury this dead, they knew about their family links because they put, for instance, two brothers together, mothers with children, etc. And another interesting thing is that there is a certain lack of adult males that maybe were brought or escaped, we just don't know. And again, this shows us the power of these techniques in looking at the archaeological record with different eyes, because that would be impossible to know without genetic information. Just looking at the skeletons, nobody would be able to guess the family links among these individuals. Another thing we see related to the arrival of the steppe nomads is that the Y chromosome they carry, especially the R1b, is just the name. The geneticists label one of these branches of the paternal chromosomes increase after the arrival of these people to the extremes in Western Europe, for instance, in Ireland or in the Basque Country.
Before this, the steppe was a patchwork of very different archaeological cultures that made different artifacts in different parts of this vast region. After the Yamnaya phenomenon, many of these groups disappear and are replaced by a homogeneous culture of people making pots and artifacts in the same way, leaving very few villages, because these people were mobile pastoralists, but leaving very rich graves in which these people were buried. These people spread over a vast territory, all the way from Mongolia in the east to Hungary in the west, and the genetics shows that they also spread into Europe and are the single primary, most important contributor to Europeans today. So an implication is that Indo-European languages almost certainly came with the second migration, and there's now evidence, as I'll tell you at the end of the talk, that this type of ancestry from these Yamnaya steppe pastoralists eventually got into South Asia today. So a plausible hypothesis is that these people are responsible for spreading these spoken Indo-European languages. Is that Indo-European languages almost certainly came with the second migration, and there's now evidence, as I'll tell you at the end of the talk, that this type of ancestry from these Yamnaya steppe pastoralists eventually got into South Asia today. So a plausible hypothesis is that these people are responsible for spreading these spoken Indo-European languages sometime after 5,000 years ago. So in Britain, this ancestry reached a couple of hundred years later, and so we published a paper earlier this year where we analyzed data from people who made these pots. So these are these bell beaker pots that
country where 80%, sometimes more than 80% of the males still carry this single lineage. And of course, this the Y chromosome is what we call an uniparental marker. It's less informative in many ways than the whole genome, but also it has the potentiality of informing us about sex biases, as we will see. Just to remind you that we have, the number of our ancestors doubles each generation. And of course, if we go back in time, we have many genealogical ancestors, but only one is the ancestor that has given us, if we are males, our Y chromosome. But this is similar to what happens with the mitochondrial DNA, which is a small circular genome that is inside our cells, and in this case, is inherited through the mothers. The situation will be similar. We'll have in this case, the mitochondrial genome, we'll have it through my mother, through the mother of my mother, etc., but not from the rest of my ancestors. But this is very interesting because it shows there is some kind of strong gender bias associated to this, the arrival of this ancestry in Europe, but not only in Europe. Then this can be observed also in India. The arrival of the ancestry takes place slightly later than in Europe, but creates also, let's say, a gradient, a climb from northwest to southeast, but also is more prevalent in the higher castes, and but also is more prevalent in the higher castes and the Brahmins. So clearly there is here not only a migration, I mean the signal of a migration that took place in the past, but also a signal of a social structure linked to this migration, in the sense that the higher, the highest the component of the step of this step ancestry, is higher in the upper class and is higher in the north of the Indian continent. And also it could be somehow associated to the disappearance of one of the paradigmatic early cultures, civilizations, the Indus civilization, that ends up around that time. And also David analyzed one skeleton from this kind of environment, which is clearly the worst probably environment for DNA preservation, and the skeleton didn't have the signals of step ancestry yet. And then we can look at the arrival of this step ancestry. As I said, somehow is biased in many ways. And for instance, in Iberia, we see the arrival of this ancestry. The higher the individual, these are different individuals. In colors, those are males that have different Y chromosomes. The higher the individual, the higher the step ancestry component. And then there is an overlap of people without step ancestry for about 400 years. 400 years is similar to the period of overlapping of the colonization, European colonization of the Americas. So I think the scale is quite similar. What happened is that at the end of this overlapping, there is no one without a step ancestry. And here is very variable. Of course, they mix with the locals, and then they end up having about 20–25% of a step ancestry, which is what we found more or less in modern Iberian populations. And then what is more interesting is that the Y chromosomes that are prevalent in the Iberian Neolithic, they are all gone. So here we have a blue one, but it's already close to the Punic arrival in southern Spain. So as I say, this is clearly a process that takes place slowly, let's say, that lasts several hundreds of years, but involves not only the turnover of the genome of these populations, as we have been seeing before, but also a significant bias by sex. So essentially what happens is that local males here, they stop having children.
The plague traveled before the migrations through trade or interaction or whatever, and it killed off all these unprepared Neolithic people, a lot of them, and it opened the doors for these decentralized steppe people to move in. This is the passage grave. 60, 70 individuals were buried within a very, very short, they all have the same dating more or less, just around after 3000 BC. We have only analyzed 3 individuals so far where we found it. We are now working on another 30 individuals. My prediction is most of them had it. That in a way that it hit these societies very, very, very badly. They were unprepared for it. They had no resistance. And how old was the plague at the time? When you look at the evolutionary clock, you can say that the plague must have started. The mutation that created plague must have started around 3700 BC. Clock, you can say that the plague must have started. the mutation that created plague must have started around 3,700 BC. And once we knew that, we had to look, where would it start? What is a likely place for plague to emerge? Plague would emerge, and mutations emerge typically when many humans and animals are together, closely together, and where there's a lot of garbage, and also where there are rodents. And rodents you find in the steppe or in steppe-like environments, because plague even today is carried by rodents. So here's our model of the spread of the plague. We have made a model saying that it emerged in Ukraine, in the big mega settlements there, where 10,000 people live together, lots of the plague. We have made a model saying that it emerged in Ukraine.
You have Babylon. Currently, they're quite subdued. They're under a group that's called the Kassites. The Kassites ruled there for about 400 years, and we're pretty quiet. They didn't do a whole lot, and so we don't worry too much about them. However, to the north of Babylon are these that are called the Assyrians, and as I say, we're going to be dealing with the Assyrians come the first of the year. They're beginning to show up. They're beginning to be a little bit more of an awesome, kind of threatening presence out there to the northeast of Israel. Right to the north of them directly is the Hittite Empire. And so that's what we're concerned about this morning, and that of course occupies this region that we call Turkey and has been traditionally called Anatolia. The Hittites were a quite mysterious civilization. In fact, for many, many years, there were those who really doubted that the Hittites even existed, or that they were anything more than a little tribal group of no great consequence. But there have been scholars throughout the centuries who thought there must have been more to the Hittites than that. And as it turns out, there was a particular archaeologist named Hugo Winkler in about 1906 who was determined to find the Hittites and figure out what the story is with these folks. And so he did major explorations of that region, kind of the plateau region of Anatolia. And he eventually found this rather extensive ruin that was a great city and was able, over the process of time, to tie it to the Hittites. This city is called Hattusha. This is a shot of the remains of the temple area that was part of that great city of Hattusha there, kind of in central Turkey. This is probably the most famous single site from that era. It's called the Lion Gate. It was the entrance to this city, and we can imagine in its day it was quite an awesome sight. He also found, interestingly, what has sometimes been called the Hittite Rosetta Stone. Rosetta Stone, you know, is language software. You knew that, didn't you? But before that, it was a stone found by the forces of Napoleon around 1800 in Egypt that was the means whereby the translation of Egyptian hieroglyphics could be accomplished. And then the Rosetta Stone term has been used for any time we find a tablet or some sort of writing in which two languages, one known, one unknown, are found side by side, and through a kind of scholarly process, we can triangulate the unknown language by means of comparisons to the known language. It's not all that easy to do, but he found this sort of Rosetta Stone for the Hittite language in his excavations there. He found it in a huge library, which was pretty well preserved and was filled with all kinds of documents. It was obviously a great treasure trove of insight and information into that particular civilization, but unfortunately it was in a fully unknown language. The odd thing was it was written in a known alphabet, cuneiform. By this time, lots of scholars could read cuneiform, but they couldn't make out the language itself. It'd be sort of like, you know, the the letters of the English alphabet, you know, but if you were looking at Latin and you'd never studied Latin, you could say the words but have no idea what you were reading, and it was that kind of problem that was discovered here. So the alphabet was known, but the language was quite mysterious. However, in that library was discovered a peace treaty, and this peace treaty was between Hattusili II and Ramses II. We talked about Ramses and Hattusili last week in connection with the Battle of Kadesh that took place in 1276. This stone indicates that after that battle that was more or less fought to a draw in 1276, right in the middle of the period of the Judges, these two great empires, the Hittites and the Egyptians, formed an alliance because they were both concerned about Assyria, which was becoming a mounting threat to both of them, and so they decided it was better to join forces and face this common enemy with a common defense rather than maintain hostile to each other. And so this peace treaty was formed. It's in 1272 BC, and it was written both in Egyptian, which was known by this time, and in the language of the Hittites, which was not known. So on the basis of that, it was discovered that this language was reflective of a great civilization at that time. Oddly enough, the language of the Hittites turned out to be one of the forerunners of the English language. And there are some words that are identical. For example, the English word water is the same as the Hittite word water. The English word water is the same as the Hittite word water. And other little interesting things about that. So, you know, for whatever it's worth, the Hittites are kind of ancient cousins of some of us here. This is an actual little piece of that peace agreement that I was mentioning. It's on display in the Istanbul Museum of Archaeology if you ever want to drop by and take a look at it. The Indo-Europeans represent a language group. This is not a racial description, but more of a group of languages. However,
bounded by the Caucasus Mountains to the north, the Pontic Mountains south of the Black Sea, the Taurus Mountains, and the Zagros Mountains. So it's a relatively hostile geography. A lot of people went through it, but few people seem to have stayed there. So I think the geography has an important impact on Armenian DNA. When we talk about the cultures which were present in the broad area, including the Armenian plateau, and some of these cultures reach far to the north, into the steppes of Russia, over the Caucasus Mountains. You have a list here of all the different cultures going back to 6000 BC, and these cultures have been evidenced by the way people lived, the pottery that they used, the tools that they used. And before these times, you had a lot of Neolithic sites in Turkey. You can see the names at the bottom, where they're uncovering very interesting early settlements, early human settlements. And we hope one day that we'll be able to tie all of these cultures and Neolithic sites to the people who are currently living. Armenians, before they became Armenians, about 25 or 2600 years ago, so we're talking 500 to 1000 BC approximately was when the Armenians started coming out as a different people, lived in an area which was inhabited by other ancient people, the Hattians, the Hurrians, Luvians, Assyrians, Hittites, Mitanni, Phrygians, Urartians. These are approximate dates. Don't hold me for them. I mean, they might be off by a few hundred years, but these are all the people who left a record in history. Before that, there wasn't enough written texts about who the people who were living there were. Some of them had languages which we were able to decipher. So how do the Armenians tie to some of these people? I'll try to address that question. Armenia has been, the territory in which Armenians have lived has been conquered many, many times by people who went through it, who stayed, who administered the area for a while, the Sumerians, the Scythians, the Persians, the Greeks, Byzantines, Arabs, and later the Turks, Mamluks, Mongols. And one question we can ask ourselves, did any of these people leave a mark on the Armenians, or did they just conquer the area and without really mixing with the local population? And at the bottom you have a list of all the other people who live in and around the area. And here also interesting questions about what was the interaction between Armenians and these people. So moving forward to some of the big questions we try to answer when we're involved in Armenian DNA, in the context of the topic today, which is the origins of people, because there's a genealogical component, which I will address soon, is what's the genetic profile of an Armenian? Can you define an Armenian genetically? Are we locals? Did we live here? Do we have deep roots in the region? Or are we a tribe which came from elsewhere and settled in these regions? And if yes, when did that happen? And as mentioned earlier, do we find in the Armenian DNA a trace of all the people who invaded us or went through the region over the years? And getting more to more interesting issues for the people living now, how close are we to our near neighbors? I'll address that question. And finally, there is a key element in DNA studies which has only emerged in the last year or two, is the study of ancient DNA, donc ancient human remains, to be able to see if the ancient skeletons, the DNA of these ancient skeletons ties to people living right now. Because you can come up with all theories that you want about where people came from and how they migrated, but when you're studying living people, you're only extrapolating. When you're able to go back into ancient DNA, here you can really reach deep into the past. And the techniques to do that have really been perfected and are getting perfected. So we're able to extract minute amounts of DNA from very ancient and deeply and badly preserved specimens. And we'll get to that. So the Armenian DNA project, Levon talked about the genesis of the project, which had been started by Mark Arslan before Hovan and I took over. The field of DNA studies, and particularly Armenian DNA studies, it's population genetics. It's something that started in the late 1990s. Genetics. Out of a I mentioned study because the amount of information, archaeology in the blood. Try to imagine an archaeologist working in the field, in a dusty, hot field, on all fours with his just paints. Here it's archaeology through the internet. That's really fascinating. I don't have ways in which hundreds of years into the past by going to the archives and looking up birth and death records. So this is one way of connecting to relatives. The second thing is that Armenian last names are not fixed, they change. .100% Armenian, and you compare him to a number of different 100% Armenians, and then you compare him to Turks and Azeris and Syrians and Georgians, you can make comparisons. And when you plot this autosomal DNA of living people using something called PCA, principal component analysis here,
from a biblical point of view, And so what I'm about to say to you now is somewhat controversial, but I'll say just from a facial, biblical point of view, the Indo-Europeans would generally be associated with the descendants of Noah.
You can get graphs like this which show who Armenians cluster with. And when you do this, one of the surprising results, of course, is that Armenians cluster very closely with Turks, especially Turks from Eastern Turkey. And that's not really surprising because once you dig a little bit deeper in Turkish DNA, you see that only a small percent of Turkish DNA actually comes from Central Asia. A little bit more of their DNA comes from Eastern Europe, from the Slavic countries. But many Turks, especially in Eastern Turkey, so it's not a surprise, and the Slavic countries, but many Turks, especially in Eastern Turkey, are descendants of autochthonous people, including Armenians at one point in time. So it's not a surprise if we're close to them genetically. Mizrahi Jews, Mizrahim, the Jews who are neither Ashkenazi nor Sephardic, who lived in Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, Iran, are also very similar to us genetically. And Assyrians also, who speak a Semitic language while we speak an Indo-European language, but genetically they're quite similar to us. And we us genetically. And Assyrians also, who speak a Semitic language while we speak an Indo-European language, but genetically they're quite similar to us. And we know from historical texts that when the Assyrian Empire reached far to the north, they assimilated a lot of Urartians into the Assyrian Empire. And of the Assyrians living now, their descendant, who knows? But they're genetically close to us.
The descendant known as Jacob, but more of a language group. This is not a racial description, but more of a group of languages. However, from a biblical point of view, and so what I'm about to say to you now is somewhat controversial, but I'll say just from a facial, biblical point of view, the Indo-Europeans would generally be associated with the descendants of Noah, the descendant known as Japheth. You know that Noah had three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham represents those who seem to have migrated largely south into Egypt, associated with the descendants of Noah, the descendant known as Japheth. You know that Noah had three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham represents those who seem to have migrated largely south into Egypt and Africa. Shem, the Semites, represent those who generally migrated east and became the Semitic races that we think about, of course. Japheth seems to have been associated with those who migrated north. So if we take seriously the biblical description of those three sons and the migrations described in Genesis chapter 10 in connection with those three sons, then Japheth would basically be correlated sudden description of those three sons and the migrations described in Genesis chapter 10 in connection with those three sons, then Japheth would basically be correlated to these Indo-European languages that became a family of languages more or less associated with Europe and to some degree with the Persians more off to the east. So this picture is attempting to try to illustrate that point. The regions that we're interested in with respect to the Indo-Europeans would be the Hittites, of course, also Troy, and there's some argument that's been made that the Trojans were in fact close cousins of the Hittites, You know the Trojan War, it takes place about this time. Also the Greek language is Indo-European, and also the Etruscan language, which is associated with ancient Italy, is Indo-European, as is English and most of the, well, all of the Romantic languages that we think about. All of these have their roots back in this Indo-European language. So it's interesting to us for that reason as well. The Hittites resided in Anatolia. They had their capital in a city that was known as Hattusha, spelled a variety of ways. This is one of them. It's right there toward the north. It was the major city that was found by Hugo Winkler. Anatolia is right in the middle of a major trade route. So if you think about the ancient world, you know that there was a great deal of trade going from Mesopotamia, which we've already looked at, up to a region that we would call the Balkans, north of Greece, and a lot of traffic went back and forth there, as well as going down into Egypt. So you see the Fertile Crescent is formed by the lower part of that little design there, and then the rest of it would go up to the north. So
they're genetically close to us. Ancient DNA. I mentioned Spain. They find that the Europeans who lived in Germany or in Spain 3,000 or 4,000 years ago don't correspond to the people living now. It means that 3,000 or 4,000 years ago don't correspond to Germany or in Spain, Europe, for example. They find that the Europeans who lived in Germany or in Spain 3,000 or 4,000 years ago don't correspond to the people living now. It means that migrations of people very often just the people who came superseded the people who were there and absorbed them or displaced them. But it's a very technical and very difficult thing to do. But this is where things are happening now, and we're coming up with fascinating results. I could do a whole talk on this subject, but won't discuss it further. But a lot of the things that I'm supposing are true about Armenians will be able to verify in the coming years once we start doing ancient DNA analysis. What happens when you study the Y DNA, the Y chromosome DNA of Armenians? You can basically or of all human beings, you can basically put them in specific groups. And this is a chart which has been recreated, haplogroups. The haplogroups are people who belong to a specific group based on shared mutations because they have a common ancestor. So in this specific map, you see the different haplogroups in the world. And you can see that there's a starting point, Africa, for all of humanity, and you can see how people spread out from Africa. And you can see also when they spread out, because you can use this not only to determine which group you belong to, but when the group came into existence and when it started moving. And this is, for example, a chart of the haplogroups of non-Africans. It'll be more meaningful afterwards. The branching points are always, can be tied to one specific individual who developed a mutation, who had a lot of sons, and these sons managed to survive and have more sons. And when you take all the people living now and test them, you can create the tree that you see by going backwards. And on the left-hand side, you can see the years. It's at the top, it's 80,000 years, then 70, 60, 50, 40, 30. The dotted line corresponds to 12,000 years ago.
The Hittites were right in the middle of a great deal of trade, and a huge amount of commerce was more or less flowing through that region. The history of the Hittites is known to some degree. A lot of it remains obscure, but we know that there were two periods in which they were of somewhat significant importance in the ancient world. One is called the Old Hittite Kingdom. It looks something like this. This is Turkey and the region that was controlled by them. This would be from 1680 down to about 1590.
Of the 14th century. And the other thing, the other set of evidence, so to speak, is very detailed in the sense that we have information on a very particular an epidemic of a plague going around. And the other thing, the other set of evidence, so to speak, is very detailed in the sense that we have information on a very particular instance of an epidemic that must have engulfed, you could say, the ancient Middle East, not just the Hittite kingdom, around, or let's say towards the end of the 14th century BC. It probably started around 1320, and according to the main source, it lasted about 20 years. Started around 1320, and
also when you
This, of course, is much earlier than the Exodus, much earlier than our present interest, but this would be the time of the patriarchs. 680 is roughly the time that Joseph was in Egypt and so on. It's before the events that we've been looking at since then. So that's the earlier period. There were several obscure kings. The most prominent of them was the last of them, a guy named Merchili. He is the one who did this sudden attack down the Euphrates and wiped out the Babylonians in 1595. If you were in this class a few weeks ago, we talked about how the old Babylonian Empire was attacked suddenly and more or less wiped out in a kind of surprise assault on them in 1595. This is the guy that did it. He went right down the Euphrates and attacked them and then went home and died. And Babylon was just left vacant, and so a group that lived at Mari, which is about halfway up the Euphrates, if you can see it on that map, a group that were Indo-European actually, took over, and that became what's called the Kassite rulers of Babylon. We'll talk a little bit about that at a later time. But anyway, this is the guy, the Hittite ruler that did that. But from that point on, the Hittites kind of lapsed into obscurity. We don't hear much about them. No certainly historical documents of any great significance until a somewhat later time, which is called the Hittite Empire. This starts about 1450 and goes down to about 1100 and is, of course, the period of time that we would associate with the era of the judges. And so we're more interested in this for the moment. There's several kings. I'll just note these kind of in passing here briefly. The first one is Tudalius. Sometime around 1450, he's reigning in the Hittite Empire. Now, the number 1450 should be significant to you. What great event takes place generally in the time frame of about 1450 in the Old Testament? The answer is the Exodus.
Welcome to the OI podcast. I'm your host, Steve Townsend, and we are here with Theo van den Hout discussing an ancient Hittite plague that the Hittites believed started in Egypt. Welcome, Theo.
Thank you, Steve, for having me.
Theo, let's start out with a basic question. Who were the Hittites?
Yeah, their period of political flowering was between 1650 and 1200 BC. Their kingdom, empire, sometimes people say, was located in what we nowadays call the modern Republic of Turkey. Right here, you see the Middle East, the modern Middle East as we know it, and you see right in the center Anatolia, which is the classical name for modern day Turkey. And you see it surrounded by countries like Greece, Russia. Iraq is not mentioned there, but of course everybody knows nowadays where Iraq is, Iran, Syria, and Egypt. And those were the main players in that period between, let's say, the second half of the second millennium BC, or what we also know as the Late Bronze Age.
What would plague have been like to people in the ancient world, or is there a comparison that we can draw to what we're all going through today?
Oh, yeah, I think not that much has changed in the sense that it must have been scary for people because plague or epidemics, pandemics, as we now like to say, are such an invisible enemy, as it's often said. You don't see anything there is, so you don't know what you can do against it. You can get it through or from everybody, so it makes it a scary thing. And
Right? Very good. I have 8 students on the front row here. Who had been reigning in Egypt up until 1450? Harder question. Thutmose III. Remember him? He's the guy that ran Moses out of Egypt. When Hatshepsut died, remember 30 years earlier, political winds change, Moses has to take off, and he does. Thutmose III was a brilliant military strategist, and he had pushed the boundaries of Egypt north through the region that we would call Canaan, and was actually pressing up against Hittite areas. Tudelius is the Hittite king who said, enough of this, and he began to push back. And that's the main thing we know. So he is kind of the one who is answering that initial pressure from Egypt to reach up and establish imperial presence that far north. So he begins to rebuild Hittite power at this time, when it'd been rather dormant now for some time. The main thing that he's remembered for is freeing a city called Aleppo from Egypt in 1450. This map will try to show you that. Aleppo is the circled city up to the north. Kadesh is to the south. That's the region where this conflict was going on.
I don't think that has changed in any way.
Do we have any documentation of such events in your studies?
Oh yeah, there are two main sources. We have a number of, let's say, more general sources. We have rituals that the Hittites performed whenever they felt there was an epidemic or a pandemic going on. These are texts that describe the ritual prescribe, if you will, that they could sort of pull off the shelf, the clay tablet with the prescription, and then they could carry out the ritual, and they would probably hope that it did its work. So